So, we come today to the last of the moral virtues, and that is justice. Justice is the virtue by which we give to the other what is due to him, that is, what we owe to him. Now, before we say any more about justice, it's very important that we're clear on some distinctions here of what justice is not. And a lot of what I'm going to say today has to do with the fact that justice is really misunderstood. So the first thing is the first error that's very common is equating fairness with justice. Now, we use the word fairness with children particularly, but many people don't outgrow that word. There is a difference. Fairness is giving everybody the same thing. It's what a lot of people in charge of the world think is the right thing to do, and that is not. Justice is giving to each person what that person is owed, and there is a difference in that. It's not always the same thing. The other confusion that comes in with justice, of course, is thinking that we're owed things that we're not. This is something that young people, whether they're biologically young or not, are very susceptible to, and most Americans. We want to be very clear on what we are actually owed. So because a right is what was owed, and we owe people what we owe them, then that is a right, and we want to understand then rights very clearly. Because on one hand, we have people, like I said, who clamor for rights that they do not have. That is very particular, especially with a lot of the ideologies. But we also have on the other side the fact that the government is very often infringing on these things. And so it's important that we really understand these. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about rights tonight, but I do want to enumerate a couple of them, the most basic ones, so we at least have those to consider as we maybe look into this more on our own. Remember, this series and the series on capital sins are in the gift shop, free with much more details. Objectively speaking, what are our rights? Using the language that we're familiar with, are, God-given rights, right? They are the right to ownership, the right to bodily and spiritual goods, to life, liberty, honor, and reputation. Again, ownership, bodily and spiritual goods, to life, liberty, honor, and reputation. So, when it comes to justice and rights, we also want to consider one area here in particular, and that is the virtue of obedience, which is a matter of justice. There are those to whom we owe obedience, principally God, of course, and those to whom He has given His authority. They have a right to our obedience. But let's clarify real quick something here. One, we all know that it has to be a just authority, and they have to be asking something just. No authority is legitimate if it is commanding something that is sinful. The other thing is that they must actually have the authority, and we see this in many sectors in the world and in the church. It's not, we don't owe obedience in areas that the person does not have authority. Just because they get by with demanding things does not mean that they actually have the authority to that. So it does require some nuance and discernment, especially when we're dealing with divine authority. But despite its importance in our relationship with our neighbor, justice, of course, also applies to God, and therefore principally to God. And what do we owe God? First, obviously, obedience. We also owe Him worship. This is something that people don't necessarily understand, especially when it comes to coming to Mass. We owe Him worship, and we owe Him the worship that He has required, not our own worship. Why just worship in my bed? Well, that's nice for you, but that's not what He's asking for. We owe God worship, and especially as human beings, we owe God worship on behalf of creation, because we are the reasonable, well, most of the time, creation, and therefore we offer worship on behalf of irrational creation as well, animate and inanimate. And so we have a duty to do that. And since you can't do it constantly, there are people who are consecrated to do so in a more specific way. Now, as with all virtues, as I've been saying, the concept is relatively simple. It's usually when it gets to the application that it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's okay. But there's a practical application I want to emphasize today in light of this series that I'm doing. You may recall, I hope you recall, that when we spoke about the capital sin of wrath, anger, that it is the passionate response to a perceived injustice. And if you deal with your own anger or other people's anger, that definition comes in really handy to understand what's going on. It's the passionate response to a perceived injustice. Remember, that perception may be accurate and it may not be, but it doesn't matter. That's the perception. That's what you have to deal with. And in order to deal with it, it helps then to understand the virtue of justice, since anger is the response to a perceived injustice. Now, what do we need to do when confronted with this anger? Well, first of all, if it's in others, we need to be patient, because regardless of whether the perceived injustice is true or not, it is still, the perception has to be dealt with. The perception is real in the sense that they are feeling it that way. And therefore, we need to help the person deal with their feelings properly, as we've spoken about frequently, with not suppressing their feelings, neither left braining it and rationalizing why they shouldn't be feeling that way, nor sinning, but definitely surrendering that to God, actively surrendering it to God in prayer. And then after we have helped them deal with their anger as a feeling, then we can give some more attention to addressing the actual injustice and whether it is perceived or whether it's real or not. And the same thing applies to us. If we are dealing with anger, especially persistent anger, especially if it's our sin of choice or because it seems to always come up in our reaction to things, we want to pay attention to this using what I just said about other people, but also considering the fact that, as I've recently learned, people who have trouble habitually with anger can be stuck in the anger phase of grieving. You might be familiar with the fact there's a common understanding among mental health professionals, and it's a pretty standard wisdom, that there are 5 stages of grief that people go through as they are grieving something. And so anger being one of those, many people get stuck in that stage, and then they stay in that response of anger to other things that go on in their lives, especially when we perceive that our anger is not justified for the degree to which we are angry in a situation. And so again, we need to prayerfully consider these injustices, these perceived injustices, and deal with them appropriately. I just want to end then with a simple admonition regarding this idea of justice. I want to encourage you to be very careful. When we emphasize our rights, and therefore justice, too much, we can end up becoming selfish and less objective. So practically speaking, this means 2 things that I want to point out. One is that we should address injustices that we experience insofar as they wound us and therefore harm our relationships and our relationship with God. So I'm not encouraging you to disregard what you have been deprived of that you're owed, but that you should be very careful. Otherwise, this focus on ourselves, again, makes us too selfish, and we end up focusing more on what we are owed instead of focusing on what we owe other people. Because in the end, we all deserve hell for our offenses against Almighty God. We all deserve hell for our offenses against Almighty God, period. And for the harm that we have done to other people. Most of the time, we're not even aware of it because of how easy it is with even just a look to hurt someone. We deserve hell for this, and so we want to be very careful about clamoring for what we deserve. May I never get what I actually deserve. And thank God that He's merciful and doesn't give it to us completely.